In January 2020, the world witnessed an unprecedented event. In response to the rapid spread of a new coronavirus, the Chinese city of Wuhan was placed under strict quarantine. Millions of people were effectively isolated from the outside world. The Chinese government shut down transportation, and countries around the world rushed to evacuate their citizens from the epicenter of the outbreak, organizing special flights and ensuring the further isolation of those who arrived. European countries, the USA, Canada, and other states quickly launched complex logistical operations to bring their people home, but with a mandatory 2-week quarantine designed to protect the population from potential infection. Evacuees were placed in specially equipped quarantine centers where they remained under strict control for about 2 weeks. On that day, many people became familiar with quarantine in its classical sense, the forced medical confinement of healthy-looking individuals who had been in an infected region. These enforced quarantine measures were something new for us, although in reality they are an ancient invention well known to people of the past. For example, Lord Byron, Isaac Newton, and Walter Scott were repeatedly confined in quarantine hospitals simply while traveling through Europe. Let us dive into the millennia-long history of quarantine and understand why it was an important part of everyday life for our ancestors. Since ancient times, the simplest and most effective way to stop the spread of disease was to isolate the sick person. People with leprosy were subject to isolation measures from early times. For almost all of history, leprosy was considered incurable and quite contagious, so people tried to avoid those affected. Beginning around the 6th century AD, lepers were isolated in special shelters. Pandemics in the ancient world were almost always accompanied by the isolation of either individual patients or entire cities or regions where an outbreak had occurred. Egyptian priests, ancient physicians, and Arab scholars all insisted on isolating the sick when symptoms of various diseases appeared, including tuberculosis, dysentery, or typhoid. But can we really begin the history of quarantine in ancient times? Not quite, because there is a crucial difference between isolation and quarantine. Isolation means separating individuals who are already visibly ill from those who are healthy in order to prevent the spread of an already manifested disease. Quarantine, on the other hand, refers to the separation of people who have been in a region with an outbreak or who have had contact with the sick, but who themselves are not currently ill. Such individuals must remain in quarantine until it becomes clear that they are not infected and pose no threat to others. Only a handful of measures resembling modern quarantine can be traced during major epidemics in antiquity and the early Middle Ages, particularly during the time of the plague of Justinian. There is little surviving information about such measures. None of the authoritative physician encyclopedists described anything similar. This suggests that early quarantine practices were not systematized and remained very localized and temporary. Everything changed when a great threat arrived from the Far East to medieval Europe, the plague pandemic, also known as the Black Death. This apocalyptic deadly disease spread rapidly via merchant ships and devastated entire cities. I have a separate video detailing how the plague spread across Europe. It's worth watching. In 1348, a newly established commission of 3 officials responsible for epidemic control in the Republic of Venice issued orders to detain trading vessels or individuals arriving from infected regions and to keep them in isolation, preventing them from entering the city or leaving. Ship crews were confined to their vessels, while those who arrived by land were housed in temporary wooden barracks for up to 40 days. Still, these measures were situational. The Commission implemented them through ad hoc decrees, depending on the epidemic situation, and there were no permanent holding stations for incoming travelers. The Great Plague did not end in 1352. It continued to flare up in localized outbreaks, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives all the way up to the 18th century. The lesson of the first wave of the Black Death was learned best by the maritime republics along the Adriatic Sea. These were the Republic of Venice and later, the Republic of Ragusa. Ragusa gained independence from Venice about 10 years after the plague began. Thanks to their strategic roles in international trade, these rival republics understood that disease control was crucial for maintaining economic stability and public safety. This realization led to the implementation of the first permanent quarantine measures. The history of quarantine in its modern sense begins in the city of Ragusa, now known as Dubrovnik in present-day Croatia. For centuries, Ragusa served as the first stop for goods and people traveling into Europe from the Middle East and North Africa. A ship or caravan sailing from Lebanon to Venice, with cargo destined for inland cities such as Milan or Munich, would likely stop in Ragusa. In July 1377, the rector of Ragusa issued an official decree establishing the so-called quaranta, a 30-day isolation period for ships arriving from regions affected by epidemics or endemic diseases such as the plague. The word quaranta comes from the Italian trenta, meaning 30. These precautionary measures became mandatory and were written into the official laws of the Republic of Ragusa. The quaranta did not involve staying on the ship. Instead, crews and their goods were required to spend their isolation period on the remote island of Murcan in special wooden buildings constructed for this purpose. A few decades later, Venice adopted a similar practice, establishing a quarantine station on a small island near the city. The island already had a monastery of St. Mary of Nazareth. Wooden facilities were added alongside, and physicians were sent from the hospital of St. Lazarus. At first, the facility was called Lazaretto, but later, due to its association with the name Lazarus, it became known as Lazaretto. This term eventually became the standard name for maritime quarantine stations. Ignoring or fleeing quarantine in the city-states was severely punished. Violators faced heavy fines, corporal punishment, and re-imprisonment in Lazaretto. The word quarantine emerged in the 15th century when all maritime stations on the Adriatic Sea changed the isolation period from 30 days to 40 days. Quarantine comes from the Italian word quarantina, which in turn is a shortened form of quaranta giorni, meaning 40 days. Why exactly 40 days? There is no definitive explanation in medieval documents, but several theories exist. The first theory is religious. In the Bible, 40 days often symbolize a time of trial and purification. The Great Flood lasted 40 days and nights. Moses spent 40 days on Mount Sinai, and Jesus fasted 40 days in the desert. The second theory refers to academic knowledge of the time, following ancient physicians who believed that 40 days was the period that differentiated chronic illnesses from acute ones. According to scholastic doctors, the plague had no chronic form and thus would manifest within 40 days. The third and most likely theory is based on simple medical observation. Physicians likely noticed how long it usually took for a disease to appear, if it appeared at all. This theory is supported by the earlier use of the quaranta, a 30-day isolation period that was later extended to the quarantina, or 40 days, based on further observation. By the mid-15th century, lazarettos in Venice and Ragusa had evolved into complex institutions. For example, in Ragusa, each lazaretto was staffed with a permanent team: a clerk, 2 physicians, a barber surgeon, a priest, a grave digger, 2 cleaners, and 2 armed guards. The original wooden buildings were gradually replaced by small stone structures near monasteries. In the 16th century, Ragusa began constructing 2 large lazarettos, one on the island of Lochrum, incidentally a filming location for Game of Thrones, and another in the eastern district of Ploch. This anti-epidemic system was truly effective. By the 17th century, it was fully operational, and the lazarettos helped Ragusa almost completely avoid major epidemics throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. So how did the coastal city-states quarantine newcomers? In the early days of quarantine restrictions in the 14th century, the system was imperfect. Many ships, much to the dismay of captains and sailors, had to undergo a month-long isolation in nearly every port. By the early 16th century, a system of special health passports was introduced. These documents recorded information about the traveler's region of origin and whether they had completed quarantine. It was essentially an early version of a COVID certificate, but for the plague, allowing people to travel more freely without quarantining in every village. Nevertheless, the passport wasn't always helpful. Venice ignored the health passport of William Harvey, the famous English physician and physiology researcher, and forced him to undergo quarantine multiple times in 1636. Outraged, he wrote complaints about being kept in a poor room, fed badly, and suffering a flare-up of his sciatica as a result. Imagine you're the captain of a 16th century merchant ship entering the port of Venice. Church tower sentries signal your arrival with red flags. You're required to take a small boat to the office of the health magistrate, who communicates with you through a window. The captain must present health passports for the crew and passengers and provide information about the origin of the onboard goods. If there was any suspicion of illness aboard, the captain would be ordered to proceed to the quarantine station, where the crew and cargo would be isolated. Sailors would live in large rooms, 8 to 10 people per room. You, as the captain, would be given a private single room, as would any noble passengers. But what about goods? Goods were unloaded on the shore and left in the fresh air and sunlight for several days. Then they were moved into special fumigation facilities where, according to schedule, they were smoked with smoldering medicinal herbs or treated near large fireplaces. All these measures, both for passengers and for goods, were carried out in the context of the contemporary understanding of how diseases spread. It was believed that illness was transmitted through miasmas, harmful vapors, or pestilential air, depending on your preference. This theory was abstract and often referred both to the general air in an infected area and to specific foul smells from garbage heaps, cemeteries, or sick individuals. According to the beliefs of the time, the contaminated air could stick to skin, clothing, and objects. Disinfection, in the terms of pre-scientific medicine, was a process by which harmful vapors were literally forced out, using fresh air, hot air, fire, running clean water, aromatic smoke, and strong-smelling liquids, such as vinegar. Materials were even categorized into those that easily absorbed harmful vapors, such as fabric, wool, and food, and those that didn't require as much disinfection, like wood, metal, or coal. Among these extremes was paper. Mail was an essential part of urban life both in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period. But what to do when letters arrived from an infected region? What if they contained urgent information? Starting in the late 15th century, mail also began to undergo special treatment. At first, letters were placed in wooden boxes with medicinal herbs, and about half a century later, mail started being sprayed with or dipped in vinegar. Some lazarettos used an even simpler and faster method of disinfection. A letter would be taken with special tongs and literally held over a fire like a grill, which left noticeable burn marks on the envelope. After such aggressive treatment, the envelope would be stamped with the phrase "netta fuori e sporca dentro," which means clean on the outside, dirty on the inside. Would you dare open such a letter if it came from a region where nearly 1 in 3 people were dying from the plague? The question of how to disinfect letters from the inside without opening them was solved by the quarantine stations in Naples after a devastating plague outbreak in 1656. Station workers began cutting off the corners of envelopes so fumigants or vinegar could reach the inside. Eventually, this was no longer done by hand, thanks to the invention of a special device called a rastel, an instrument resembling a child of a waffle iron and a torture device. Dozens of holes were punched in the letter, and then it was placed in a smoke chamber where it was treated with hot air or aromatic smoke. The practice of mail disinfection persisted for a very long time, even after the last plague epidemics in the 18th century. Burned or vinegar-stained letters that are now kept in museums and private collections mostly date from the 19th century. Large volumes of mail were disinfected during outbreaks of yellow fever in the United States, cholera in Europe, and smallpox outbreaks that regularly occurred around the world. Still, smallpox spread by mail was taken especially seriously during the American Civil War, when a smallpox outbreak began in a Union Army unit after several soldiers received letters from quarantined family members and loved ones. In 1904, the Australian Postal Service disinfected all letters with carbolic acid for 3 months after a man with smallpox arrived in Tasmania. During World War I, mail was disinfected to prevent the spread of typhus. In the photo, a 1916 envelope from an Austrian military camp is stamped Desinfiziert, meaning disinfected. Back to the quarantine stations. The Italian Lazaretto system was slowly and awkwardly introduced across Europe. After the first Adriatic lazarettos appeared in the 14th century, only a few French ports built primitive quarantine stations by the end of the 15th century. But the plague, which kept returning to major European cities throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, eventually forced at least those countries which economies heavily relied on maritime trade, namely France, Spain, and Portugal, to implement permanent quarantine measures in their ports. Great Britain was very slow to adopt quarantine measures. Even after the Great Plague of London, which killed over 100,000 of the city's residents, the country still refused to invest in expensive public health quarantine infrastructure, which had long been successfully protecting most of Italy from epidemics. In the fall of 1710, amid rumors of plague spreading in Baltic ports, Jonathan Swift, author of Gulliver's Travels, wrote to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, begging him to take at least some action. A few days later, Parliament passed England's first quarantine law. The system of state-run maritime and land quarantine stations proved effective. It is believed that the last plague epidemic in Western Europe occurred in Marseille in 1720. No major outbreaks were recorded after that. The fact that the plague was suppressed in the 18th century did not mean quarantine systems were defunded. The disease was far from eradicated in Africa and the Middle East. There, it became endemic, meaning it was constantly present. Thousands of merchants, pilgrims, refugees, and officials from the Ottoman Empire arrived daily at European ports, posing a direct threat. But the biggest challenge was faced by the Habsburg monarchy, which in the 18th century had a long land border with the Ottoman Empire, over 2,000 kilometers from the Carpathians to the Adriatic Sea. In Wallachia, Moldova, Serbia, Bosnia, and Herzegovina, the plague lingered and flared up continuously for more than 40 years, like a seasonal cold. After a series of its own epidemics in the early 18th century, Austria decided to radically separate itself from the endemic territory and militarize the border, creating a kind of military zone 20 to 50 kilometers deep. There, fortifications and military settlements were built to ensure the constant presence of soldiers along the border. From the mid-18th century, quarantine stations began appearing along trade routes. Special rules were developed in case of new plague outbreaks in the border regions. When the epidemic situation was calm, traders were subject to a mandatory quarantine of 21 to 42 days. If a plague outbreak occurred near the border, the quarantine lasted 84 days. News about plague in the Ottoman Empire was gathered by Austrian spies and passed on to the military as quickly as possible. After 1756, the borders were completely closed to travelers from Turkey following any news of a plague outbreak. Anyone who tried to cross the border or escape quarantine faced the death penalty. These strict measures helped eliminate plague outbreaks within Habsburg territory. The country became one of the leaders in epidemic intelligence and land-based quarantine infrastructure in the 18th century. Frequent outbreaks of yellow fever and smallpox in British American colonies forced the authorities to delay ships and set up temporary quarantine posts. To prevent disease spread along the coasts, they started building special quarantine stations where passengers and cargo were isolated. The first permanent quarantine hospital was opened in Philadelphia in 1743. It was later sold, and in the early 19th century, a second, larger and more modern quarantine station was built, a grand complex, the first of its kind on the North American continent. Over the century, the station received hundreds of ships and thousands of travelers, mainly immigrants. The Lazaretto building has survived and is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. In the first half of the 19th century, maritime and land quarantine systems were implemented in most European countries, as well as the US and Canada. In addition to the plague, still endemic in the Ottoman Empire and parts of the Far East, yellow fever from Latin America and cholera from endemic regions of India became serious threats to the Western world. The spread of these new diseases was accelerated by colonialism as European powers expanded their territories and trade, bringing previously unknown illnesses back from the colonies. First, the victims were colonial troops and administrators. Then modern, fast ships and trains transported pathogens quickly to large cities, where high urbanization and population density created ideal conditions for outbreaks. The second cholera pandemic, which spread from India into the Russian Empire, Prussia, France, and hit London, caused hundreds of thousands of deaths and forced European nations to tighten sanitary cordons. Quarantine stations continued to operate under the same protocols as in the 17th and 18th centuries, but much had changed and the quarantine process became unbearable. The population had become more mobile and the number of travelers increased dramatically. Trade volumes grew as well, so long delays of raw materials at the border resulted in major financial losses. Each country had its own rules and quarantine durations, which led to numerous bureaucratic complications. People were often forced to remain in quarantine several times in a row, spending months in isolation. Obviously, the stone-built quarantine stations were not designed for such large waves of travelers and trade caravans. As a result, temporary camps were hastily constructed with tents or wooden barracks where travelers had to live in poor sanitary conditions. In the 1820s to 1830s, liberal segments of the population began to view imperial quarantine as a tool to restrict personal freedom, suppress opposition, enable corruption, and even carry out espionage. As we discussed earlier regarding mail disinfection, it was believed that at quarantine stations, letters were not only disinfected but also secretly read. A fierce battle also unfolded at the scientific level. Contagionist doctors, supporters of the infectious disease theory, argued that illnesses spread through contact with infected people or objects and considered quarantine to be an effective measure. Anticontagionist doctors, on the other hand, supporters of the miasma theory, believed that disease-laden air emerged not from person-to-person contact, but from unsanitary conditions in a region. In their view, quarantine would be of no help. The latter argument was frequently used by politicians who opposed quarantine in order to defend economic interests. It's worth remembering that in the first half of the 19th century, the role of microbes as pathogens was not yet known. All of these contradictions ultimately exploded during the revolutions of 1848, also known as the Spring of Nations, and prompted European states to convene the First International Sanitary Conference in 1851. The goal was to find ways to relax quarantine restrictions to promote trade and facilitate travel, while still effectively protecting countries from new epidemics. At that conference, agreement was reached on several key principles for standardizing quarantine procedures. But the convention and its rules were not ratified. Throughout the second half of the 19th century, a series of international sanitary conferences took place. With the improved understanding of disease epidemiology thanks to the work of Pasteur and Koch, the participating countries eventually reached consensus on most issues. In 1902, they signed a convention consisting of 184 articles which laid out plans for restructuring the quarantine system. From that point on, the practice of forcibly detaining travelers at quarantine stations began to disappear, as did the disinfection of mail. The old walled lazarettos were transformed into infectious disease hospital wards, and forced confinement was replaced by monitored home self-isolation and temporary closures of public venues. During the Spanish flu pandemic, modern measures appeared, such as social distancing, respiratory hygiene, and widely available personal protective equipment. Because we had thoroughly studied the nature of existing diseases, the need for forced confinement faded. But whenever a new, unknown illness emerges that poses a deadly threat, countries once again resort to restricting individual freedoms in the name of the greater good and public health, just as in the Middle Ages. An example of this was the Ebola outbreaks, when sanitary zones were established in West African countries with checkpoints on roads and entire villages placed under quarantine, surrounded by armed patrols. A new deadly unknown emerged in China at the end of 2019. And already in January 2020, the country adopted unprecedented measures. Instead of recommendations for self-isolation, there was a complete ban on leaving entire cities. Millions of people found themselves in conditions of total lockdown aimed at halting the spread of the disease. As harsh as these measures seemed, they proved effective. By the end of February, China had made significant progress. The rate of new infections declined, and the strict restrictions began to be gradually eased. During the outbreak, practically everything came under suspicion, even cash. But while in the past letters were fumigated with aromatic smoke, now banknotes were withdrawn from circulation, treated with ultraviolet light or hot air, and then isolated for 2 more weeks. This practice was first introduced by Chinese banks and later adopted by financial institutions in other countries, from Singapore to the United States. Quarantine in the classical sense, as forced medical confinement, remains the only effective response to the unknown, something we have not yet studied and fear. Because if it escapes into the world, humanity may face dark times. Therefore, as long as we understand the nature of all known pathogens, we can remain calm, and there is no need for sanitary confinement, for now.